The morning George Winthrop discovered his marriage was unraveling, the sky was crystal clear. He stood in the kitchen of their stately brick home in Chestnut Hill, absently stirring a cup of black coffee. Outside, the dogwood tree was just beginning to bloom, pale pink petals shaking gently in the breeze. It was a perfect spring morning, the kind that lulls you into thinking everything in your world is exactly as it should be. But George knew better. 12 years with Ella had taught him the subtle difference between quiet and silence. And lately, there was too much of the latter. She moved through the house like a whisper, there, but not present. Her gaze seemed to skim across him, never resting too long. Her laughter, once soft and sincere, had become sparse and practiced. She no longer sang while washing the dishes, no longer touched his shoulder in passing. There were no fights, no harsh words, just a slow, almost graceful drift away from him. It had been 2 months since she started her evening art classes. A way to reclaim herself, she'd said, pouring a third glass of Merlot that night, the red sloshing like blood in her glass. George hadn't objected. He loved Ella. He wanted her happy, but he couldn't shake the sense that she was discovering happiness without him. That morning, as he reached for the paper, something caught his eye on the front page of the art section. A black-and-white photograph of a man, mid-40s, tousled hair, paint-splattered jeans, piercing eyes. The article introduced Adrian Lee, a contemporary artist whose European exhibitions had gained a cult following. He'd returned from Paris to open a private studio in Boston. Ella's art teacher, it turned out. George glanced up just in time to see Ella pause by the doorway, her eyes locking onto the article. Her face remained unreadable, but her lips parted, just slightly, as if something had slipped. Then she was gone, humming to herself as she climbed the stairs. It was the first time she'd hummed in weeks. George folded the newspaper, set down his mug, and stared at the space where she'd just stood. The house was still again, but not peaceful. The wind rattled a loose shutter on the second floor, a soft tapping, like a warning. Something was coming, something neither of them could take back. Ella spoke about Adrian with the kind of reverence reserved for people who changed lives, not just paintings. He doesn't teach like a professor, she told George one evening, her eyes bright with something unfamiliar. He evokes, like he's pulling something out of you that you didn't know was there. George smiled thinly and nodded, but the words echoed in his head long after she left for the night class. Pulling something out of you. He wondered what Adrian was reaching in to touch. The classes, once held twice a week, now ran 3 times. Then 4. He's offering studio hours, she explained, almost apologetically. If I want to grow, I need to immerse myself. And I do, George, I want to grow. She used to say things like that about their marriage. George started staying later at work, poring over forensic reports with bleary eyes and a thudding in his chest. Not from the bloodied case files or crime scene reconstructions, but from the gnawing question that shadowed him now. What exactly was she painting? He asked, gently, one night after she returned home, her cheeks flushed and speckled with what looked like charcoal dust. Could I see some of your work? Ella hesitated just a fraction of a second. They're not ready yet, she said, smiling, smoothing her hair behind her ear. Not even close. He nodded, though the answer felt like an empty door slowly closing. The next day, George noticed something new. She had changed her perfume. It wasn't the subtle lavender she'd worn for years. This one was deeper, smokier, like amber and embers. It clung to her skin like the echo of a secret. When he leaned close to kiss her cheek, he paused, as if trying to memorize it. That night, she left her phone on the nightstand, screen facing up. George wasn't a jealous man, and he'd never considered himself the type to snoop. But as he changed for bed, he saw the screen flash with a new message. Hey, you were fired tonight. I can't wait to feel your brush again. Your hands. Tomorrow, same time. His hand froze midair, just above the screen. Adrian. It had to be. His pulse thundered. He reached for the phone, then stopped. He didn't open the message. Didn't scroll. Instead, he stood there in the dark for a full minute, the screen dimming, the silence around him folding tighter like a shroud. Ella was in the shower, steam curling from beneath the bathroom door. Humming again. The same tune she used to sing in the kitchen, years ago, when she'd still danced barefoot in his shirts and called him her storm after the rain. George stared at the phone, then turned away. In forensics, he knew how to preserve evidence. How not to contaminate a scene. He would wait. but the fracture had already begun. A week later, Ella insisted George accompany her to Adrian's gallery opening. "It's important," she said, her tone unusually soft. "You'll finally get to see what I've been working on." "What we've been working on?" George tried not to linger on that last word, but it stuck in his throat like glass. He forced a smile and agreed. The event was held in a refurbished textile mill turned art space. Concrete floors, exposed brick, steel beams. Industrial elegance. The kind of place where secrets might echo for 100 years before fading into dust. Ella wore a black satin dress he hadn't seen before. The neckline dipped lower than she typically dared, and her lipstick was a shade darker, bloodier. She looked radiant, dangerous, like someone he'd have wanted to meet in another life, one where she wasn't already slipping through his fingers. As they entered the gallery, a chill swept down George's spine. Dozens of paintings lined the walls, some abstract, others figurative but surreal. Bodies blurred into color, faces half-sketched, half-drained. It was beautiful, but unsteady, like walking through someone else's subconscious. People murmured softly, glasses clanked. And then George saw him. Adrian Lee. The man was taller than expected, lean and magnetic. His salt and pepper hair was pushed back carelessly, and he wore a paint-streaked blazer over a white tee, like he belonged both to chaos and control. Adrian's eyes found Ella instantly. He smiled. A slow, familiar smile that didn't waver when George stepped forward beside her. "So this is the husband," Adrian said, voice warm but measured. He extended a hand. "You must be proud. Ella's work is breathtaking." George shook his hand. His fingers were calloused, like a sculptor's. "She's always had it in her," George said calmly. "Just needed the right spark, I guess." Adrian chuckled softly. "Ah, well said." They moved through the gallery together, and Ella drifted just slightly ahead with Adrian, as if pulled by some magnetic line. George trailed behind, studying the art, the colors, the tension in every canvas. And then he stopped. There it was, the painting, titled The Secret Flame. At first glance, it was abstract. Wild streaks of crimson and gold and ash gray. But beneath the chaos, barely visible beneath the brushstrokes, was a woman's figure, arched back, bare shoulder, lips parted in ecstasy. Her hair was unmistakably Ella's. George felt as though the floor shifted under him. He stared at the painting, the raw intimacy of it, the way the light seemed to lick across her skin. It was like walking in on something that wasn't meant for his eyes. Ella's voice reached him from across the room. "I modeled for that one," she said lightly, not looking at him. Adrian called it his turning point. George didn't respond. His jaw clenched. He wasn't sure if he was furious or devastated. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe numb. Later, while pretending to admire a grotesque bronze sculpture, he saw Ella and Adrian slip out to the private balcony above the courtyard. He followed slowly, his heart pounding, careful not to draw attention. Through the glass doors, he saw them. Ella was laughing, really laughing. Her hand brushed Adrian's chest lightly, as if it had always belonged there. Adrian leaned in, and though their lips didn't touch, they might as well have. Everything in their posture, their breath, their presence, spoke of something already shared. George turned away. He didn't storm out. He didn't confront them. He simply walked to the farthest room of the gallery, found a quiet bench, and sat down. Outside, the rain had started. Gentle, relentless. It sounded like applause. Ella had always loved the garden. When they bought the house, she'd claimed the overgrown backyard as her canvas, coaxing beauty out of chaos. Rose vines, lavender bushes, wild hydrangeas in every hue. It had once been their shared place, where Sunday mornings were spent sipping coffee while she pointed out which plants needed repotting, and George just nodded, pretending to understand but loving the sound of her voice. Now, she went there alone. George watched her from the upstairs window. She moved slowly, gracefully, weaving between planters and a thin white shirt smeared with streaks of grain. Her hands disappeared into the soil with an urgency that felt desperate, almost ritualistic, as if something inside her was buried, and she was digging her way back to it. She used to garden in old jeans and a messy ponytail. Now she wore loose skirts and linen tops that clung to her when she sweated, her hair tied back in silk. She looked like someone in love, not with the garden. That same day, she left the house earlier than usual, claiming she had a one-on-one session with Adrian. He'd invited her to work on a large-format collaborative piece. George didn't ask for details. Didn't press. He nodded, kissed her cheek, and followed her. Not immediately. He waited 15 minutes, then left in silence. He drove his old Corolla downtown and parked a block from the studio Adrian had converted from a former shoe factory. George had looked it up weeks ago, out of morbid curiosity. From the alley, he could see the top windows. Large, curtainless panes of glass bathed the loft in warm natural light. Inside, he saw movement. A silhouette, Ella. Then another taller. Adrian. They were standing close. Too close. At first, it was innocent. They examined a canvas together, heads leaning in, hands gesturing. But then George saw Adrian reach out, just lightly, tracing something along Ella's jawline. She tilted her head into the touch, her smile slow, tender. George looked away. His fingers dug into his palms until the skin stung. He didn't go inside. He didn't confront her. Instead, he sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, heart hammering loud enough to drown out his thoughts. He remained there for an hour, unmoving, while the sun dipped lower, turning the sky gold. Eventually, Ella emerged from the building. She was glowing. Her walk was different, lighter. Her hair was down, windblown, and she had a faint streak of blue paint along her neck. Adrian stayed at the doorway, watching her leave. She didn't see George as she drove past. She turned on the radio and sang along. And in that moment, George knew she wasn't coming back to him. Not really. Not where it mattered. Back at home, she greeted him with a kiss on the cheek and a soft, "Dinner in 30?" He nodded. He said nothing. Just watched her walk into the kitchen and open a bottle of wine. She began humming again. The same soft tune. The roast smelled like rosemary and garlic, just the way he liked it. But everything tasted like ash. It happened on a Saturday morning. The sun had barely crested over the tops of the trees, casting golden fingers across the kitchen floor. George sat at the table, elbows resting on the wood, a mug of untouched coffee in front of him. Ella was upstairs, showering. She always sang in the mornings now. It used to be for him. The night before, she'd come home late again. No explanation, no guilt in her eyes. She smelled of turpentine and musk, and beneath it, something that wasn't her perfume. Something that wasn't his. George hadn't asked. But today, he was done waiting. He rose slowly, walked to the drawer by the sink, and opened it. Her phone was where it always was while she showered, plugged in, screen up, trust still intact like a relic from an earlier life. But George didn't hesitate this time. He opened it. She hadn't changed her passcode. 4 digits. Their anniversary. The message thread with Adrian was near the top. He clicked it. There were dozens of texts. Some flirtatious. Others poetic. Many intimate. Adrian, when you touched my chest yesterday, I forgot how to breathe. No one has ever made me feel like you do. Ella, you see me. Not the wife. Not the routine. Me. I didn't know I was still there. Adrian, let me have you again on Sunday. Don't wear anything beneath that blue dress. Ella, I want to live in the space between your fingertips and my skin. George read each word like a slow poison dripping down his spine. He didn't speak when she came down the stairs. Morning, she said brightly, towel still wrapped around her damp hair. I was thinking pancakes today. He looked at her, then at the phone still in his hand. Her smile froze. George. He turned the screen to face her. The message thread. The words she couldn't take back. For a second, her mask cracked. Not shock. Not shame. Relief. Like a wound finally opened wide enough to breathe. I saw you, George said, his voice low. At the studio. On the balcony. And again last week. I watched you kiss him. I know. She didn't move. Her eyes glossed with something distant, maybe sorrow, maybe freedom. I wasn't trying to hurt you, she whispered. I swear I wasn't. But it just happened. I didn't expect Adrian. I didn't go looking. George's jaw tightened. But you didn't stop it, either. Ella's voice trembled. Because with him, I feel something again. Something I thought I lost a long time ago. It's like color after a decade of grayscale. I don't want to lie to you, George. But I also don't want to lie to myself. He stared at her like she was a stranger in his home. You could have told me, he said. Before the lies. Before the painting. Before you became someone I couldn't recognize. Tears welled in her eyes. She stepped forward, but he didn't move. I didn't know how, she said. You're so steady. So safe. And I didn't want to break you. I'm not broken, he said calmly. I'm just not blind anymore. A silence stretched between them, thick and final. Then, without a word, he walked past her, out of the kitchen, into the living room. The clock ticked on the wall. Outside, birds chirped like nothing had changed. He heard her crying behind him, soft, like a storm trying to hide in the distance. George didn't turn back. He didn't need to. He finally knew what had to come next. The days that followed felt like walking through a burned-out house. Nothing was technically ruined, no shouting, no broken dishes, no slamming doors, but something essential had been scorched. The foundation still stood, but the warmth was gone. What remained was just furniture, walls, shadows. They didn't speak about the messages again. Ella moved into the guest room without ceremony. She took only what she needed, a few outfits, her sketchbook, a pillow. The wedding photos stayed on the mantel, unacknowledged. A museum relic. Neither of them dared touch it. They tried therapy. Once. The counselor, a soft-voiced woman with far too many degrees on the wall, asked them how they fell in love. George remembered Ella's freckles, how she read poetry aloud in cafes, how she once held his hand in the rain like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. Ella smiled wistfully and said, "He made me feel safe." And George realized that somewhere along the way, safety had turned into invisibility. The therapist asked if they wanted to repair the marriage. Ella hesitated. George didn't. He knew what was gone. He felt it in her distance, in the way she avoided his gaze when speaking, in the way she no longer filled the house with little hums and questions and unspoken affection. The woman he loved was still in front of him, but the part that had belonged to him had been carved out and handed to someone else. So, instead of healing together, they simply paused. Ella stayed in the guest room. George took longer shifts. He drowned himself in casework, blood patterns, timelines, motive. There was a strange comfort in solving other people's tragedies while ignoring his own. He started jogging in the mornings 5 miles before sunrise. His feet hit the pavement like clockwork, breath ragged, thoughts chaotic. It wasn't fitness he craved. It was erasure. Meanwhile, Ella was changing in small ways. She wore brighter colors, smiled to herself. Once, George caught a glimpse of her sketchbook left open on the kitchen table. He shouldn't have looked, but he did. The page was filled with pencil sketches of a man, Adrian, unmistakably. His hands, his jawline, his eyes. On the last page was a drawing of herself, seated, naked, back arched, arms crossed tightly across her chest. Vulnerable, but strong. Alone. That night, she brought home a canvas. She leaned it gently against the wall of the living room before saying softly, "It's for you. I painted it for you." George hesitated before looking. It was stark, minimalist, a dark blue field, cracked with veins of gold and white. In the center stood a figure at the edge of a cliff, wind in her hair, facing the horizon. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was an apology. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Ella said quietly. "Only understanding." George stared at the painting for a long time. He didn't know what to say, didn't know what she wanted to hear. But for the first time since the betrayal, he realized this wasn't about fixing anything. It was about mourning what they'd lost. Later that night, they ate dinner in silence, sitting opposite each other like strangers who once shared a language now forgotten. The clock ticked. The wind outside whispered through the cracks in the windows. And somewhere in the house, something they'd spent years building continued to quietly fall apart. They didn't mark a date on the calendar. There was no official conversation, no definitive "we're over." It just happened. Quietly, like frost claiming a window pane. Ella found an apartment downtown, a loft above a small coffee shop that smelled of espresso and old books. She said it was temporary, but George knew better. Temporary things didn't come with brand new curtains and scented candles. When she told him, they were sitting on opposite ends of the couch. A commercial played on the muted television, the kind they used to make fun of together. "I need space," she said, staring at her niece. "To think. To find myself without hurting you more than I already have." George didn't argue. He only nodded, too exhausted for the fight neither of them wanted anymore. They packed her things on a Sunday afternoon. It was surreal, their home stripped down to essentials, her favorite mug bubble-wrapped, the painting of the cliff woman carefully boxed. George helped without a word. Every time he opened a drawer and found something of hers, a bracelet, a sock, an old grocery list in her handwriting, it felt like slicing open a healed scab. She didn't take everything. She left the ring on the kitchen counter, placed it gently in the center, like an artifact. George didn't touch it. After she drove away, the silence in the house felt different. Before, it had been filled with tension, weight, the ache of betrayal. Now, it was hollow, grieving, a body missing a limb. Family and friends asked questions. George offered safe answers. "We're giving each other time. She's finding herself. It's mutual." It wasn't. Not really. But he wasn't ready to dissect the full truth. Not yet. Some nights he stared at old photos, not to remember her, but to study his own face. to see what love used to look like in his eyes, to see what he'd lost of himself, not just her. One evening, he saw her again. At the farmer's market. She was across the street with Adrian, holding a small pot of herbs in one hand, a canvas tote slung over her shoulder. She was laughing. Not politely. Not nervously. Truly laughing. That sound, the one he hadn't heard in their home for over a year. George didn't look away fast enough. She saw him. Their eyes met across the gap of strangers and sidewalk traffic. She didn't look startled. She smiled, a soft, sorrowful kind of smile, the kind people give graves or goodbye letters. He nodded and kept walking. When he got home, the house was still and unbothered. He made himself tea, not coffee. He turned off the overhead lights and lit the small lamp beside the reading chair. He wrapped himself in a blanket Ella used to curl up in. And for the first time since she left, he exhaled without pain. He was still hurting, yes, but the wound had stopped bleeding. And there was something strange, something barely perceptible, creeping beneath the ache. Relief. Time didn't heal George in a clean arc. It wasn't cinematic. There was no epiphany in the rain, no neatly tied resolution. Healing came in fragments, some barely noticeable, others sharp and sudden, like stepping on broken glass barefoot in your own home. It started with a blank canvas. It had been sitting in the attic for years, Ella's, originally. She had bought it during their second anniversary trip to Cape Cod, swearing she'd paint something inspired by the sea. She never did. It had gathered dust in a corner behind old chairs and forgotten lamps. One afternoon, George pulled it down. He didn't have a plan. He wasn't an artist. But he needed something, anything that wasn't the silence. He bought a cheap set of paints, cleared space in the garage, and stood there for nearly an hour before making the first mark. It was ugly, chaotic, a blur of thick lines and jagged colors. But it felt honest. And strangely, he felt better afterward. Lighter. So he kept painting. Not well. Not professionally. But with purpose. Each canvas became a piece of him he didn't know how to articulate. Anger. Loss. Guilt. Relief. Joy. Regret. He didn't try to hide those things in beauty, he let them live in color. Loud and honest and raw. He started sleeping better. He ate real meals. Reconnected with a few old friends. Stopped avoiding the hallway where their wedding photo once hung. He didn't take it down. He just stopped staring at it. 1 month, then 2. Seasons changed. Leaves turned, fell, returned. He didn't think about Ella every day anymore. That realization startled him when it hit. There had been a whole morning, maybe even an entire afternoon, where she hadn't crossed his mind. And it didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like progress. Then, one afternoon, the gallery downtown hosted a community exhibition. Local artists. No expectations. A friend from work encouraged George to submit something. He laughed it off at first. What right did he have? But later that night, standing in front of one of his darker, Messier paintings, he thought, maybe it's not about being good. Maybe it's about being real. He submitted a piece. A week later, it was hung near the entrance of the gallery. A black canvas splashed with muted oranges, bleeding indigo, and a thin line of white cutting through the center. He called it Fault Line. Opening night came. George arrived quietly, hands in his pockets, ready to blend into the crowd. But then he saw her. Ella. She stood alone in front of his piece, arms crossed, head tilted slightly to the left, the way she always looked at things she was trying to feel instead of analyze. She didn't notice him at first. But when she did, she smiled, not the sad kind, not the guilty one. Just warm, familiar, respectful. She walked over. It's raw, she said. But it's real. First thing I finished in a while, George replied. There was a pause. I'm proud of you, she said. And for once, there was no ache in those words. No longing. Just kindness. Honesty. Thanks, he said. I'm learning how to start over. Her eyes shimmered just a little. Me too. They didn't linger. No talk of what went wrong. No apologies dragged into the open. Some things didn't need revisiting. Some ghosts could stay ghosts. She left before the crowd thinned. George stayed a little longer. That night, he returned home, made tea, and stood in front of his newest blank canvas. And for the first time, he didn't think about what he'd lost. He thought about what he might create next. By fall, the air had shifted. Sharper mornings. Crisp leaves. The smell of change hanging in everything. George's house was quieter now, but not heavy like before. The silence was different, no longer full of things unsaid, but of peace-hard one. The kind of silence that no longer demanded to be filled. Ella's ghost lingered in small ways. Her handwriting still labeled some of the spice jars. Her garden bloomed faithfully, lavender thriving under her careful design, though she hadn't touched it in months. Sometimes, when George passed through it, he'd pause just long enough to remember the way she used to sing there with dirt under her fingernails. But the ache wasn't sharp anymore. Just a whisper. A faded photograph in the corner of a dusty drawer. He had grown used to the space she'd left behind. Some days, he still caught himself thinking of her, wondering if she ever painted the oceans she used to dream of, or if Adrian had become more than just a spark. But he didn't feel jealous. He didn't feel much at all, other than a quiet gratitude that she had once been his person, even if she no longer was. One morning, while walking by the Charles River, he saw her again. She sat on a bench, sketchpad in her lap, knees drawn up, hair messy and windswept. Alone. Focused. She didn't notice him at first, and he could have turned away, walked past, let her remain an unfinished chapter. But he didn't. He approached slowly. When she looked up, she didn't seem surprised. Just calm. As though they were two old friends bumping into each other in a city too small for real distance. Sketching? He asked. Ella smiled, soft and weathered. Trying to. Is it working? She glanced at the page. Some days, yes. He sat beside her. Not close, just near enough. They didn't speak for a while. The river whispered beside them. Ducks floated lazily in the current. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophone played from a passing boat, notes drifting like smoke. I miss the garden, she said finally. The way it used to be. George nodded. It misses you too. She turned toward him. Are you okay? I'm getting there. She smiled. Good. You deserve to be. There was no tension. No electricity. Just grace between them. Two people who had once built a world together and now stood on separate shores of that memory. George stood first. Take care of yourself, Ella. I will, she said. You too, George. And that was it. No promises. No reaching back. Just a soft goodbye where once there had been storm and fire. As he walked away, he realized he didn't need her to love him again. He didn't even need to understand everything that had happened. He only needed this peace. And he had finally found it. George woke before the sun. The house, once echoing with someone else's absence, now held only his presence. It didn't feel lonely. It felt settled. He brewed coffee the way he always had, black, strong, quiet. The machine hissed and clicked like an old friend, and the smell filled the kitchen with its daily promise. You made it through another day. As he waited, he wandered to the window. Outside, the street was still. Mist floated along the pavement like a secret. The dogwood tree had lost most of its leaves, but one stubborn blossom clung to the branch, pale and defiant. George smiled. He thought about the man he used to be, the one who clung to routine like armor, who mistook silence for peace, who had believed love was something you could hold on to even when it stopped holding back. And then he thought of who he had become. He had learned how to let go. Not out of anger. Not even out of grief. But because he'd discovered that loving someone doesn't always mean keeping them. Sometimes, it means releasing them, and yourself, with dignity intact. He walked to the garage. The canvas from last week leaned against the wall, unfinished. A burst of soft yellow over a field of gray. He hadn't touched it since his walk by the river. But today, he picked up the brush. He added a streak of gold, then a line of white, clean, bold, purposeful. It cut across the center like a sunrise breaking through cloud. He didn't title it. He didn't need to. Later, he stepped outside, coffee in hand, the morning air brisk against his skin. No noise. No Ella. No echo of her laughter in the hallway. But there was something else. Hope. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just enough. He took a deep breath. And with the first light of dawn spilling across the sky, George stepped forward into a day unwritten, into a life that was wholly, finally, his. And this time, he was ready for it.